Anubis intimidated everyone he crossed paths with, and it was immediately clear why. He was far from an ordinary dog, a fact the veterinarian realized the instant Anubis and his owner, David, stepped inside. Without hesitation, the veterinarian contacted the police. Meanwhile, David sat in the waiting room, completely oblivious to what was unfolding. But the police were about to make him regret ever buying this dog. David's first instinct was to get his dog, Anubis, and make a run for it. He still did not understand why the veterinarian had called the police, but he did not want to risk his beloved dog being taken away. It was already too late for that. Before he managed to make his way out of the veterinarian's office, the police had already arrived, and there was nowhere for David to go now. He did not want to give up Anubis without a fight, but when the officers started to explain themselves, David's demeanor changed. Everything suddenly became clear. Anubis was no ordinary dog. How had I overlooked this for such a long time? But why had the veterinarian contacted the police about David and Anubis? What was wrong with the dog, and could David accept giving him up? David had not planned on buying a dog that day, but the moment he locked eyes with Anubis, he could not look away. The look lasted only a moment before the strange dog, with its yellowish eyes and sharply pointed ears, shifted his attention back toward the wall of the pen. David found himself moving closer, even though he actually felt slightly afraid of the dog. But there was just something about him. David knew he was taking the dog home for two reasons. The first was that he had already mentally named the big black dog Anubis. The second was that the man selling the dogs in the corner of the farmer's market did not seem to care for the animals particularly well. The dog David was specifically interested in had only come in yesterday. The seller grunted something about how everyone else thought the dog looked too mean, and said he would probably end up getting handed over to animal control to be put down if no one bought him. Hearing that news, David knew he could not leave the dog behind. Part of him feared that the man, who seemed less than trustworthy, would charge a price that David could not afford. Thankfully, this was not the case. The seller just seemed eager to get rid of the strange dog. In his gut, David knew that he should probably first discuss bringing a dog into the house with his wife, Monica, particularly when it was such a dangerous-looking dog, and considering that he and Monica had a set of 4-year-old twins. Who knew how this eerie black beast would react to children? Time was running short as the seller was beginning to pack up for the day. David could not bear the idea of Anubis being sent to a shelter and killed, so he made a decision. David knew his wife well enough to predict that she would refuse this dog if he asked her. Without consulting her, David paid the sketchy seller and guided the unusually quiet and obedient Anubis to his truck. Throughout the entire drive home, the peculiar dog remained calm, silently gazing out of the window. It was only upon arriving home that David realized he had not heard a single sound from Anubis. David had never seen a dog behave like this before. Had Anubis undergone some specialized training in his previous life? Perhaps he had been a police or military dog who had failed to make the cut. This kind of composure could not be normal, right? David could feel the angry stare of his wife, Monica, burning through the window when he stepped onto the porch with Anubis. Luckily, his two sons, Melvin and Marty, reached the door before she did. David held his breath, tightening his grip on the leash. Would Anubis suddenly become aggressive? Monica hurried up behind the twins, her fear unmistakable. Anubis, however, remained unbothered, handling everything with an eerie calm despite his intimidating appearance. Melvin and Marty were overjoyed, jumping around and declaring that Anubis was the coolest-looking dog they had ever seen, while the dog maintained his serene demeanor. Monica found it hard to stay angry, but she was still furious. How could David have made such a decision without asking her? What had he been thinking, bringing home a dog like that out of nowhere to be around their children? And why would he buy a dog from a random man at a farmer's market? Once Monica had said everything she needed to say, David apologized for not talking to her first. Then he explained the entire situation. When she heard that Anubis would have been sent to a kill shelter if not for David, Monica's anger softened. She admitted that, despite her initial impression, she actually liked Anubis. She just worried about having him around the twins, who could be quite boisterous and loud. David agreed that supervising the twins whenever they were around Anubis would be a good idea for a while, but he was confident that Anubis would end up deterring a lot more than potential burglars. Much to David and Monica's relief, Anubis quickly proved himself to be a perfectly capable family dog. Nothing seemed to bother him, and as a bonus, his intimidating demeanor made him an excellent guard dog. While Monica and David found this a bit uncomfortable, it did not seem to trouble Anubis at all. When either David or Monica walked Anubis through the park, other dog owners, joggers, and passers-by would give them a wide berth, instinctively keeping a safe distance. Anubis had been living with David, Monica, and the twins for nearly a month, and his stoic, silent nature had not changed since day one. David could not help but feel uneasy about how the dog seemed almost entirely devoid of emotion. Nothing upset him, nor did anything excite him. The appointment was booked for 3 days later. In the time leading up to the appointment, David decided to do some research of his own. He wanted to understand why Anubis was so unlike any other dog he had ever encountered. But nothing he found online seemed to match the strange behaviors he was observing. Eventually, David resolved to let the veterinarian handle it. He had no idea that this simple checkup would turn into an ordeal that would change everything. David was still unsure of what breed Anubis actually was, let alone what might be wrong with him. He had some ideas, but none seemed to completely match. Probably only the vet could help him find out the truth about Anubis. After several hours of research, the twins begged to come along to the appointment, insisting they could help keep Anubis calm. But David decided to leave them at home, just in case something was seriously wrong with the dog. He did not want his children to feel uneasy, especially when Anubis clearly did not need anyone's help to stay calm. David was certain that not even the cold, clinical atmosphere of the vet's office could unsettle this dog. However, the visit would soon prove to be far more terrifying for David than he could have ever imagined. When he arrived at the clinic that afternoon, the waiting room was packed. Several earlier appointments had run long, and an emergency situation had thrown the entire schedule off track. David and Anubis had to wait, and they were getting a lot of looks. Some pet owners quietly slipped their animals back into carriers or tightened their grips on leashes. It was clear they were afraid of his dog. David had grown used to this reaction by now, but this was the first time it would actually come back to haunt him. An employee approached him, looking visibly uncomfortable. With an apologetic expression, she quietly asked if he and Anubis could wait outside for their appointment. Some of the people in the waiting room had complained about feeling unsafe. David glanced down at Anubis, who remained as stoic as ever, completely unbothered by the tension around him. David took a slow breath, swallowing his disappointment. This dog would not hurt a fly unprovoked, and David knew it. But Anubis would probably always be mistrusted, judged by appearance alone. The other people in the waiting room avoided making eye contact as David quietly stood and led Anubis outside. He tried not to let it sting, but it did. David could never have predicted how much that decision would change everything. They had only been outside for a few minutes when a man in a long coat walked by, then suddenly stopped. His eyes locked onto Anubis, and something shifted in his expression. "Is he yours?" the man asked, his voice low. David confirmed, feeling a flicker of defensiveness rise in his chest. But the man surprised him. He knelt beside Anubis without hesitation, studying him closely. Unlike everyone else, he did not flinch or recoil from the dog's intimidating presence. The man explained that he was the senior veterinarian, just returning from his break. He was in a rush for his next appointment, but something about Anubis had caught his attention. He did not want to elaborate on what exactly had drawn his interest, but he promised to speed up David's appointment if he agreed to switch to his care instead of the vet David had originally booked with. David hesitated, glancing down at Anubis, whose golden eyes gleamed in the afternoon light. Something about this man's reaction, the way he had stopped in his tracks, sent an uneasy chill through David's body. Still, he agreed to the switch. He could never have known just how much he would come to regret that decision. The man seemed strangely eager. His enthusiasm made David uneasy, but since it was cold outside and he had no idea how much longer they would have to wait, he agreed. The senior vet walked into the building, visibly satisfied, and David was called in just 10 minutes later. He felt the angry stares of the other people in the waiting room, their eyes burning into his back as he passed by. They obviously realized he had been allowed to cut the line, but David did not care. These people and their pathetic prejudice could suck it as far as he was concerned. David led Anubis into the office where the senior vet was already waiting, dressed in full protective gear. The sight made David pause. The vet looked more like he was preparing for surgery than conducting a routine checkup. As David began explaining his concerns about Anubis, the vet barely seemed to listen. He kept circling the dog, examining him carefully, his gloved fingers lightly brushing the dog's sleek black fur. David's words felt like they were floating into empty space. Halfway through the conversation, the vet abruptly cut David off. "I need to take care of something quickly," he said, disappearing through a side door and locking it behind him. David blinked, baffled. He could hear muffled voices beyond the door, but could not make out the words. The conversation lasted only 2 minutes, but when it stopped, the vet did not return. David waited. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. His patience thinned with each passing second. He tried the door handle, but it did not budge. He knocked, then banged, then shouted. No one answered. David's chest tightened. Why were they treating him this way? Did this have something to do with Anubis? His heart pounded, frustration boiling into fury. Without thinking, David kicked the door with everything he had, splintering it open with a loud crack. The vet stood calmly in the adjacent room, completely unfazed. David, breathless and shaking, demanded an explanation. The vet glanced at his watch and finally spoke. "I have contacted the police," he said matter-of-factly. "They should arrive at any moment." David's world tilted. The police? He demanded to know why, but the vet simply shook his head. "They will explain better than I can," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. David's adrenaline surged. He did not need an explanation, not when he could already imagine the outcome. They were going to take Anubis away. He was not going to let that happen. Without hesitation, David turned and bolted for the other door, Anubis gliding silently at his side. But it was already too late. The wail of sirens echoed from the parking lot. Red and blue lights flooded through the windows. David's heart dropped like a stone. The police blocked David's path, hands resting on their belts. It was clear they were not leaving without Anubis. An animal control vehicle stood ready nearby. David's chest heaved with adrenaline. He planted himself in front of Anubis, arms outstretched like a human shield. "If you want my dog," he shouted, voice cracking with emotion, "you will have to go through me." One of the officers slowly stepped forward, palms raised in a calming gesture. "Sir," he said, his tone gentle, "please listen. The senior vet identified your dog during the examination. He called us to report what he found." David froze, heart hammering in his chest. "Identified him?" he echoed. "What do you mean?" The officer nodded. "The dog you bought from that shady seller is not just any dog. He belonged to a religious leader in Mexico City. The man is well known for preaching Aztec traditions and culture." David's pulse thundered in his ears as the officer continued. "In Aztec culture, dogs like yours are believed to guide souls to the underworld. But this particular dog, his real name is Zolo, had a special role. He would sit beside the leader during funerals, his unshakable calm a symbol that the deceased soul was at peace. Zolo's stillness brought comfort to grieving families, reminding them that death was not something to fear." The officer's voice softened. "Zolo was stolen months ago by people seeking to undermine the leader's teachings. He was thought to be dead, until now." David's knees nearly buckled. It all made sense. The dog's eerie tranquility, his utter lack of reaction to anything. Zolo had been trained for this. He was not just a pet. He was a symbol of hope. Tears welled in David's eyes as he turned to look at Anubis. "No, Zolo." David's pulse thundered in his ears as the officer continued. "In Aztec culture, dogs like yours are believed to guide souls to the underworld. But this particular dog, his real name is Zolo, had a special role. He would sit beside the leader during funerals, his unshakable calm a symbol that the deceased soul was at peace. Zolo's stillness brought comfort to grieving families, reminding them that death was not something to fear." The officer's voice softened. "Zolo was stolen months ago by people seeking to undermine the leader's teachings. He was thought to be dead, until now." David's knees nearly buckled. It all made sense. The dog's eerie tranquility, his utter lack of reaction to anything. Zolo had been trained for this. He was not just a pet. He was a symbol of hope. Tears welled in David's eyes as he turned to look at Anubis. No, Zolo. The dog met his gaze with the same unwavering serenity he always had, as though he already understood what was happening. David dropped to his knees, wrapping his arms around Zolo's neck. "I am going to miss you, buddy," he whispered, voice breaking. Letting go was one of the hardest things David had ever done. But he knew Zolo had a purpose far greater than being a family pet. He belonged to the people who needed him most. The religious leader, overwhelmed with gratitude, not only showered David with thanks, but also sent a generous reward for Zolo's safe return. In time, David and his family adopted a new dog, one with all the proper paperwork and a temperament everyone agreed on. They named her Luna, and she quickly became a beloved member of the family. But every so often, especially during quiet moments, David would catch himself thinking about Zolo, and he would smile, because he knew the dog who had silently guarded his family for a brief time was out there, still bringing peace to those who needed it most.